This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
You can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/citationsneededpodcast. All your support through Patreon is incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener-funded and run zero ads, have zero commercials, and have no corporate sponsors.
Yes, so if you can help us remain independent and keep the episodes free at the same time, we'd be very grateful. So please, if you can, subscribe and sign up to our Patreon.
The World Bank and its president have been doing an important constructive job the past 5 years, announced the Southern Illinoisan in 1973. IMF assistance has put Jamaica well on the road to recovery, reported the Winnipeg Sun in 1982. The Trans-Pacific Partnership could be a, quote, legacy-making achievement, unquote, for Barack Obama, suggested the New York Times in 2015.
These are the dominant narratives surrounding so-called development initiatives, whether structural adjustment loans or free trade deals. Arrangements like these, we're often told, have been and continue to be essential to the economic maturation and societal improvement of poor countries. Countries that shift from nationalization to privatized industry and land, so-called liberalize trade policies, and institute a host of other free market reforms are destined for greater efficiency, reduced poverty, and the much-coveted seat at the table in the global economy.
And yet, all too often, this isn't quite the effect that these initiatives have. What we don't tend to hear about is how economic development arrangements, engineered by wealthy countries like the United States, for example, through IMF loans, NAFTA, or the TPP, don't promote, but rather reverse the development of exploited countries. Media minimize not only these initiatives' destructive effects on economies, labor, and social programs in service of U.S. corporations, but also their relationship to the punitive U.S. immigration system and their extensive role in mass global displacement.
On today's episode, part 3 of our 3-part series on immigration narratives, we'll examine the displacing effects of quote-unquote development and quote-unquote free trade deals, as well as their connection to the increasingly militarized immigration deterrence machine, asking why capital is allowed to move freely, but people aren't.
Later on the show, we'll be joined by Dylan Sullivan, adjunct fellow and PhD student in the School of Social Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, where he teaches in politics, sociology, and anthropology. His research focuses on global inequality, colonial history, and the economics of socialist planning.
The costs of production in the Global South externalized. So what I mean by that is that labourers in the Global South are paid less than what they ought to be paid, what they would be paid if capitalism actually was a system of free markets and labour could, move around the world and move to high-wage areas. Costs of labour in the South are externalized and are compressed and forced to artificially low areas. The ecological costs of production are often not accounted for in the South, or the North either, but in the South this problem is much larger.
Yeah, so this is part 3 of our 3-part episode on nativist immigration narratives in U.S. media. And we thought it was a topic that is virtually never talked about in the context of immigration, which is the idea that mass immigration is driven and fueled in large part, not entirely, but in large part by global inequities. And so you can't really talk about immigration to the global North from the global South, generally speaking, without talking about how there are economic drivers of that poverty, and that poverty is not a law of nature, but is in many ways man-made and man-created. And this is a spiritual sequel, and we'll cover similar themes of 2 episodes. Episodes 45, The Not-So-Benevolent Billionaire, Bill Gates and Western Media, and episode 146, Bill Gates, Bono, and the Limits of World Bank IMF-approved celebrity activism, where we kind of discuss how this charity model, this Western billionaire-led charity model is the alpha and omega of our concept of global justice, and how that's maybe not a good thing. Today, we're going to discuss the ways in which the post-World War II and post-Cold War economic architecture has, in many ways, driven poverty and created the conditions that make migration both necessary and inevitable. We will not be discussing There's sort of a big elephant in the room with a lot of this, which we've touched on in the previous 2 episodes, the ways in which U.S.-backed wars and coups and CIA meddlings have informed much of this poverty in the global south, because it's something we've covered a lot on the show. But suffice to say that all that goes hand in hand with what we're discussing today, which we think is actually far less explored and in many ways equally important than that kind of interference, which is using quote unquote economic policy to push a pro-US, pro-global north agenda that does contribute to the transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north, again, which we believe is a policy choice, not some inevitable byproduct of meretricious capitalism.
Yeah, there's this notion that there are some countries or some continents even that are just inherently inferior or inherently poor, right? It's why you hear disgusting phrases like shithole countries describing places that just aren't in the global north, that maybe people are migrating from or moving around because of economic and other political situations. And there's a reason for that, right? So we're going to get into that today. So to begin, let's talk about what the IMF and the World Bank actually are. They are 2 of the most prevalent international financial institutions, known as IFIs for short, both founded in 1944, the year before the end of World War II. Both were products of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Now, that's no relation to the United Nations, which was established the year later. It was also known as the Bretton Woods Global Financial Policy Summit. And these 2 institutions were developed to, quote, create the framework for post-war international economic cooperation and reconstruction, end quote. While all 44 allied nations participated in this summit, 2 of them were particularly influential. I'll wait a second so you can guess which 2 they were. The conference's agenda and resulting institutions were based on ideas from the United States and Great Britain, specifically from Harry Dexter White, a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and John Maynard Keynes, an advisor to the British Treasury. 4 years later, in 1948, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, which gave aid to Western European countries in exchange for information about their internal economies and domestic policies. Subsequently, the World Bank shifted its focus to, quote-unquote, development. That is, lending money under extremely burdensome conditions to impoverished countries around the world. Often, these quote-unquote development initiatives were designed to contain and quash socialist and or anti-colonial governments.
These development initiatives were and continue to be dressed up in humanitarian rhetoric. After all, you can't just lend people money because you want to make money or want to control them politically. You do it because you have a higher moral cause. In the early 1970s, World Bank President Robert McNamara, previously seen carpet bombing Indochina, announced the institution's new twin goal to, quote, accelerate economic growth and to reduce poverty, unquote. McNamara, who was the former Secretary of Defense under President Johnson, wanted to spearhead this supposed humanitarian project of reducing poverty. The World Bank under McNamara received much glowing press coverage at the time. From July 16, 1973, the Southern Illinoisan said, quote, World Bank works. The World Bank and President Robert McNamara have been doing an important constructive job in the past 5 years. This from the Honolulu Star Bulletin from the same year. To end poverty, Robert McNamara, president of the World Bank, has thrown a provocative challenge to the world. By the year 2000, he says the world should put an end to absolute poverty, a condition he defines as poverty so extreme that it degrades the lives of individuals below the minimal norms of human decency. The Sacramento Bee from the same year. A headline reads, McNamara reminds rich nations of moral duty to aid the world's poor. But in reality, the World Bank had the opposite effect. In 1990, World Bank economist Martin Revellian developed the first ever international poverty line, or IPL, noticing that some of the world's poorest countries' respective poverty lines hovered around $1 a day. But this metric actually demonstrated that the World Bank had exacerbated global poverty. According to a former guest and friend of the show, Jason Hickel, quote, using this threshold, the World Bank announced in its 2000 annual report that the absolute number of those living on $1 per day or less continues to increase. The worldwide total rose from 1.2 billion in 1987 to 1.5 billion as of 2014, and if recent trends persist, will reach 1.9 billion by 2015. Unquote. This was alarming news, especially because it suggested that the free market reforms imposed by the World Bank and the IMF on global South countries during the 80s and 90s in the name of development were actually making things worse.
Now, part of what we're going to talk about today on Citations Needed began in earnest in the early 1980s with the advent of so-called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. Now, SAPs are loans provided by the World Bank and IMF to quote-unquote developing countries on the conditions that the recipient governments, many of which had histories of nationalized industry, open themselves up to privatization, and relatedly to liberalize their trade and investment policies and slash social spending, among other austerity measures. Now, according again to Jason Hickel, SAPs include two basic mechanisms for debt repayment. In his 2018 book, The Divide, Hickel explains it this way, quote, "First, developing countries had to redirect all their existing cash flows and assets toward debt service. They had to cut spending on public services like healthcare and education, and on subsidies for things like farming, food, and infant industries. They also had to privatize public assets by selling off state companies like telecoms and railways. In other words, they had to reverse their developmentalist reforms. The savings gleaned from spending cuts and the proceeds of privatization would then be funneled back to Wall Street to repay debts. In other words, public assets and social spending retroactively became collateral in the repayment of foreign loans, an arrangement that was, of course, never agreed at the time the loans were signed." End quote.
And of course, these SAPs, these structural adjustment programs, were typically met with uncritical media coverage and fanfare. They were seen as humanitarian projects meant to, quote unquote, develop these poor countries. Here's one article from September of 1982 in the Winnipeg Sun, quote, "Jamaica turns tables on woeful economy. When the current Jamaica Labour Party government came to power less than 2 years ago, the country was in a severe decline with more than 1 Jamaican in 4 out of work. Soaring inflation, falling production, and foreign debts in excess of $1 billion US. But in the short time since, Prime Minister Edward Siega said in an interview, IMF assistance and the return to free enterprise philosophy have reversed this trend and put Jamaica well on the road to recovery." Unquote. As the Institute for Policy Studies noted in 1998, though, SAPs share a common objective: to move countries away from self-directed models of national development that focus on the domestic market and towards outlooking development models that stress the importance of complete integration into the dominant global structures of trade, finance, and production, unquote. Even when the structural adjustment programs do fulfill certain promises, like, for example, eliminating hyperinflation, they have devastating effects on local populations. To quote the Institute for Policy Studies again, quote, "SAPs have bankrupted local industries, increased dependency on food imports, gutted social services, and fostered a widening gap between rich and poor. Data also shows that structural adjustment programs have worsened health system access and increased neonatal mortality."
Yeah, so you can see how, with the rise of this development system from the 60s through the 70s on up to today, you also see a concurrent rise in migration, and namely immigration from the global south to rich countries like the United States. According to Pew Research, the share of U.S. immigrants born in Mexico and Central and South America grew from 20% in 1970 to 31% in 1980 to 41% in 1990. Pew adds this, quote, "By 2000, Mexico alone accounted for a third, or 34%, of recent immigrants, up from just 11% in 1970. And the total from Central and South America reached 48%, end quote. There are, of course, many reasons that this happened, one of which, as Pew cites, was the 1965 cessation of the national origins quota system that favored European immigrants, which we discussed on our previous episode, part 2 of this series, which was really focused on the U.S. manufactured immigrant distinction discourse, right? Migrants versus refugees, for instance. But more liberal immigration laws alone aren't enough to motivate people to uproot their lives. There are other, largely economic reasons for these shifting statistics, many of which can be traced to the cumulative effects of policies of the United States and these IFIs, the international financial institutions that we've been discussing.
Now, these changes in immigration patterns resulted in no small part from the 1994 North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which removed, quote, barriers to trade, unquote, between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. This process has begun in the 1980s with the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT, G-A-T-T, but accelerated with the enactment of NAFTA, which, like so many IFI agreements before it, continued the process of privatizing industry and land, especially in Mexico, that U.S. corporations took full advantage of. The architects of NAFTA promised to raise the wages and standards of living for Mexican people closer to the United States and Canada. The AP reported in November of 1993, quote, NAFTA hopes pact brings better jobs. The article would go on to say, quote, Antonio Gonzalez Rodriguez makes $12 a day, cutting steel sheets that are welded into gas tanks at the Armebe Metallicos plant in Mexico City. He makes what his American counterpart makes an hour. Low Mexican wages are at the center of debate over North American Free Trade Agreement sent by President Clinton to the U.S. Congress on Wednesday. The House votes on the agreement November 17th. Critics complain that Mexico will steal thousands of American jobs, but NAFTA supporters scoff at the suggestion most Mexicans work and live in extreme poverty and said NAFTA will actually help raise Mexican wages. Quote, I have heard about this treaty, some good things, so maybe it will help bring more jobs and better paying jobs, said Gonzalez. Grit smeared from making gas tanks for buses, trucks, and stoves, unquote. But NAFTA's effects were greatly detrimental to workers internationally, specifically workers in Mexico. Historian Eric Loomis spelled out some of the human stakes in a 2018 article for the New Republic, noting that U.S. corn companies taking advantage of NAFTA drove Mexican corn farmers using pre-industrial methods out of work. This happened in other agricultural sectors as well, as he explained, quote, in 1995, Mexico imported 30,000 tons of pork from the U.S. In 2010, 811,000 tons. Mexican hog farmers, undermined by NAFTA's trade provisions, had to leave their farms to make a living. Many migrated north. Some of the very farmers displaced in Veracruz were recruited to work at a North Carolina Smithfield hog processing plant. When they tried to unionize in 2007, Smithfield had the undocumented union members deported, willing to pay the fine for immigration violations rather than unionize the plant, unquote. The effects of NAFTA are still felt acutely. Public Citizen, a progressive think tank, reported that by 2019, 25 years after the enactment of NAFTA, wages in Mexico had fallen below pre-NAFTA levels, contrary to the promises of NAFTA supporters that were made at the time about Mexicans' living standards increasing. The minimum wage, in fact, declined 16.7% by 2019, as employers took advantage of worker displacement and a lack of unions.
At the time of NAFTA's passing, assumptions about improved standards of living led to similar assumptions about decreased migration. As scholar Magdaleno Manzanares writes, quote, among these new policies, communal lands, or ejidos, were targeted for reform. 2 years before the three North American countries signed the trade agreement, Mexico adopted new constitutional provisions to privatize communal lands. The underlying assumption was that agricultural land in private hands would increase production, create new economic opportunities for campesinos, and improve the overall socioeconomic conditions of this neglected sector of Mexican society. Therefore, supporters of NAFTA on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border expected a decrease in Mexican migration to the United States, among other benefits. End quote. But NAFTA had the opposite effect. According to David Bacon, the author of books like The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration, and Illegal People, How Globalization Creates Migration and Criminalizes Immigrants, the number of Mexican migrants in the U.S. went from 4.5 to 12.5 million in just 20 years. These new immigrants were farmers who'd been, as Bacon writes, quote, driven off the land after being undercut by cheap U.S.-subsidized corn flooding the Mexican market, or workers suddenly jobless after waves of privatization, end quote. Now, in concert with its creation of such perilous conditions, forcing people to leave their homes and uproot their lives, the United States beefed up security along the border with Mexico, launching a series of cruel immigration, quote-unquote, deterrence operations. One of these projects was 1993's Operation Blockade. During this operation, hundreds of Border Patrol agents were deployed along a 20-mile stretch of the border between El Paso and Juarez, in an effort to reroute migratory paths along terrain that was especially hard to traverse and inconspicuous to Texas residents. The first National Border Patrol Strategy document, released in 1994, stated this, quote, the prediction is that with traditional entry and smuggling routes disrupted, illegal traffic will be deterred or forced over more hostile terrain, less suited for crossing and more suited for enforcement, end quote.
And if this formula looks similar to domestic populations, it's because it is. You create austerity, you create poverty, you reduce or remove social welfare, and in parallel, you increase criminalization by saying that, look at all these bad people trying to break the law.
This type of strategy would become known as prevention through deterrence. It was developed thanks in no small part to an accumulation of media narratives in the early 1990s about people crossing the border, especially via the Rio Grande. For example, the McAllen, Texas publication The Monitor reported this on April 1st, 1991. Quote, Salvadorans arrested. 11 broke and hungry Salvadorans have been arrested by Reynosa authorities attempting to cross the Rio Grande into the U.S. The aliens are being held in the Matamoros Immigration Center, awaiting word on whether they will be sent back to El Salvador or whether their request for asylum in Mexico will be granted. End quote. And here's another excerpt. This from the News and Observer of Raleigh, North Carolina, published on July 21st of the same year, 1991. The headline reads, quote, illegal migrants still pouring in, end quote. The article would say this, quote, some of these people will catch several times in an evening, said Juan Solis, a Border Patrol supervisor. I sympathize with these people. They're coming here for economic reasons, but I'm just trying to do my job. The article would continue to say this, quote, the border is the best place to catch people, Mr. Solis said. The farther they get from Mexico, the harder they are to spot, end quote. It goes on, quote, Ramon Perez, 22, crossed the Rio Grande on a crude raft and spent 4 days with no food and little water trying to find his way on foot around a Border Patrol checkpoint. He says this, quote, I couldn't walk anymore, he said as he sat in a holding cell at the checkpoint on Interstate 35. I was very dizzy. But if Mexicans really want to get past the Border Patrol and escape into the U.S., Mr. Solis said, they can do it. And Solis is quoted one more time saying this, quote, 99% of the aliens who keep on trying will eventually make it. It's just a game, end quote.
The next year, 1994, which also saw the beginning of NAFTA, also saw the launch of Operation Gatekeeper, which was designed to further militarize the border and use the element of starvation to deter quote-unquote illegal immigrants. According to a 2019 Washington Post op-ed by Pedro Rios, director of the American Friends Services Committee's U.S.-Mexico border program, he wrote that Gatekeeper was, quote, a massive undertaking involving the construction of walls and fences along parts of the border that were easier to cross and dramatically increased the Border Patrol's personnel and technology it uses for border surveillance, trends that continue to this day. Rios added, quote, poor conditions exacerbated by NAFTA caused the number of migrants to increase, and the increased border militarization stemming from Operation Gatekeeper pushed migrants to take more dangerous and treacherous routes through the desert and mountains. Conservative estimates are that more than 8,300 people have died trying to cross the border since Operation Gatekeeper began, a rate of nearly one each day for the past 25 years, unquote. So that's one death per day over the last 25 years. This Operation Gatekeeper, this deterrence strategy, basically making people more subject to dying of thirst and starvation and excruciating heat to quote-unquote deter people from coming to the border, is still U.S. policy. So let's fast forward to the 2010s. The global neoliberalization campaign took an especially stark form with the pushing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which climaxed in 2015 and 2016. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, was never ratified, and the Trump administration withdrew in 2017. It would have expanded many of NAFTA's policies, including privatization of public services and copyright and patent protections, which, as we discussed in our news brief with Max Alvarez about the Obama documentary, the TPP was opposed by literally every single labor and environmentalist group and health group on Earth. I mean, it was almost universally opposed by every progressive organization, even very kind of mainline, normie, liberal ones. It would have allowed corporations to sue governments in order to override their laws, specifically when it came to things like patent and environmental and labor protections. The TPP would have ramped up devastation similar to that of NAFTA and almost certainly would have fueled more immigration from Asia because of it. But the media were largely silent on these dangers. Indeed, many outlets had conflicts of interest. The highly secretive TPP negotiations were being led by corporations like Disney and Comcast, both of which own major U.S. media channels, ABC and NBC respectively. Disney is also a major investor in Vice Media, and Comcast is a major investor, in addition to owning NBC, is a major investor in Vox Media. Indeed, Vox Media spent millions lobbying for the TPP and in fact boosted a TV appearance by Obama on a Comcast network to shamelessly plug the TPP as fun and cool and anti-Trump. I wrote about this at the time in June of 2016 for an article for fair.org about this entitled Comcast-Funded Website Plugs Comcast-Owned TV Show Promoting Comcast-Backed Trade Pact, one of my all-time favorite headlines. in which I detailed how, so the Jimmy Fallon show had Obama on to do this thing where he'd slow jam the news. And this was at the height of the TPP negotiations. Now, keep in mind that the TPP at the time was opposed by every major Democratic candidate, including Hillary Clinton. Nominally, although no one really believed it. I think even the New York Times editorial board kind of rolled their eyes and sort of didn't really believe that she would ultimately oppose it.
Okay, sure.
But, people like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders were leading the charge against it. Groups like Public Citizen, again, every environmental group, name it, opposed it. But what this Vox article did is it, of course, ignored all that and tried to make it look like the TPP. I mean, it's basically an infomercial for the TPP. It's quite shameless. That it was somehow a Trump thing, that being opposed to the TPP was solely a Trump thing. Vox would write, quote, "It's no secret that Donald Trump wants to do away with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and implement his own trade rules abroad, many of which economists say, which economists we don't know, will lead the United States into recession and put Americans out of work." Okay. "The TPP is a, quote, disaster," Trump said Tuesday night. He would go on to say, quote, "almost as bad as NAFTA," unquote. On Thursday night, President Barack Obama had a response in the form of a smooth slow jam in his appearance on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. So we're going to listen to that clip right here.
Now, there will be no third term. I can't stay forever. Besides, Daddy's got a Hawaiian vacation booked in about 223 days. But who's counting? That being said, the American people face an important decision this fall. The entire world is watching, and they look to us for stability and leadership. Now, I know some of the presidential candidates have been critical of my foreign policy. I don't want to name any names.
He's talking about Donald Trump.
But I believe it is of the utmost importance to work alongside other world leaders. That's why I signed the Iran nuclear deal. That's why we reopened diplomatic ties with Cuba. And that's why I negotiated the new trade deal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP.
Now hold on there, Press Dispenser. Are you saying you're down with TPP?
Yeah, you know me. Look, Jimmy, the TPP allows American businesses to sell their products both at home and abroad. The more we sell abroad, the more higher paying jobs we provide here at home. It's that simple.
So what you're saying is this trade deal will help put everyday Americans back to work, 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 work. Put it back to work, 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 work. You put it back to
work, 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 work.
So both the Vox article and the Jimmy Fallon bit give the direct impression this is an anti-Trump thing, right? Sort of.
Exactly. If you support diplomatic moves like the Iran deal, opening up relations with Cuba, this is hand in hand with that. And if you oppose this, then clearly you are anti-diplomacy, right? Anti-increased employment for Americans. It is positioned and framed in such a way that to support the TPP is to support the Obama agenda. And at the time, of course, in 2016, this was hugely influential to a lot of centrists, certainly to more liberals and progressives who were seeing the rise of Trump as a real threat to what they perceived as a different kind of diplomatic order that Obama had built during the previous 8 years.
Yeah, and this is painful to watch because, again, it was so reactionary. It really did undermine local government control. I mean, there were situations where they actually had to revise it because anti-tobacco laws could be subject to lawsuits from health activists. If a country passed a law banning tobacco sales, if it undermined the profits of tobacco companies, that those governments could be sued for lost wages. This was true of environmental regulations. It was true of labor regulations. It was a horrible deal. Again, this is why it was opposed by basically the entire progressive bloc. But you would know this reading. And again, Comcast spent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying for the TPP. And they're using two of their properties here to promote it in this really kind of sinister, poppy, dopey Jimmy Fallon way. And ultimately it was defeated because of that opposition, because it had no real support. Because people had seen what NAFTA had done. People have seen what NAFTA had done to both the US and Mexico. And all it did is churn the milk until some cream rose to the top and went to 3 counties in Connecticut and Virginia. And that's not what, that is not as politically popular. You can only really do this scam every now and then. And the coverage of the TPP was largely uncritical. It was way more critical than it was for NAFTA, because I think that it was harder to kind of pull it off, I think, a third time or fourth time, whatever trade deal pack we're on now. But these types of quote unquote trade deals, they sound so benign, they sound esoteric, they sound technical, and they really obscure, and the lack of critical coverage obscures the real human stakes because it is oftentimes so far off. It is so abstract. It is hard to see. Again, it does things like bring down inflation. So in the short term, it seems like it's quote unquote, developing a country. But in many ways, they do real harm to local economies and local workers. And of course, those harmful effects result in people needing to move to places with better economic opportunities. And you'll see this a lot. People say, well, if America's so bad, right? You guys like to blame America. It's so bad. And well, why does everyone want to come here? And it's like, well, if I'm a feudal lord and I have 99% of the wealth on my feudal holdings, right? If I have this large acreage of property and I have all these feudal holdings and all my serfs want to come work inside my manor for wages because it's better than working the fields, does that mean the manor is some benevolent thing? It's sort of Fortress America.
Or that the manor isn't the cause of them not being able to continue to subsist by working in those fields.
Right. So it's like, just because you've cornered the market and extracted 90% of the wealth and people need to have, some better portion of that wealth, from 10 crumbs to 12 crumbs, that doesn't necessarily make the feudal lord sitting in the manor somehow benevolent or caring.
To discuss how these global banking systems create not only dependency, but also devastation and destruction across the world, driving migration and the movement of people, we're now going to be joined by Dylan Sullivan, adjunct fellow and PhD student in the School of Social Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, where he teaches in politics, sociology, and anthropology. His research focuses on global inequality, colonial history, and the economics of socialist planning. Dylan is going to join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by Dylan Sullivan. Dylan, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Thank you, Nima. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I want to sort of begin with our first question, which is, to what extent the relationship between the post-war, post-World War II, and to some extent post-Cold War economic global order gave rise to inequality between the so-called global North and global South, talking about how these systems emerged, what their kind of broader logic was, and how both intentionally and maybe even unintentionally they created this divergence that is empirically very, very, very profound and one that has caused much of the so-called quote-unquote immigration issue.
Yeah, so the main thing to understand about the global economic system and why it produces such huge levels of inequality is that the structure of the global economy is structured in such a way that it essentially siphons resources out of what we might call the global south or the periphery of the world system and funnels these resources, all this wealth and labor and these natural resources and raw materials into what we might call the core economies of the global north. And there's a few ways that this kind of unequal regime of global exploitation works. And there's been a lot of scholarship on this in recent decades in sociology and economics and political economy. And really one of the main ways that this occurs is through what economists call unequal exchange. So unequal exchange was a term which was first used, or at least first brought to prominence, by Aguirre Emanuel, who was an economist working mostly in the 1970s. And he used this term unequal exchange to refer to a situation where some regions of the global economy export more labor and more resources than they import due to imbalances in the global pricing system. To sort of put that a bit more simply, the trade appears to be balanced in monetary terms. That is, in dollar terms, the South are paid for the resources and labor that they export. But in real terms, in terms of the actual labor and resources involved, the South's exports are worth more than what they're importing. And there's a few ways that this occurs. So essentially what we get is this kind of, Emmanuel called it a invisible transfer of wealth to the South. Because the monetary value of trade appears to be balanced, we don't see on a country's national accounts or on their balance of payments books, we don't see the transfer of resources going on, but it's quite real. And the reason this happens is because, well, there's really two reasons. So first of all, what we need to understand is that the global economy has a kind of monopoly structure. We tend to think of capitalism as a system of free trade. But in fact, if we want to talk about capitalism as it actually exists, if by capitalism we mean the system that we live in rather than some imaginary fairy tale world cooked up in Microeconomics 101, if that's what we mean by capitalism, then we have to understand it as a system of monopoly. The rich countries of the global north have a monopoly in most of the dominant industries in the world economy: high technology, aerospace, engineering, chemical industries and bioengineering, pharmaceuticals. And this monopoly is enforced through a number of mechanisms. One of the most important ones in the 21st century is intellectual property rights, which mean that global south countries simply aren't allowed under World Trade Organization trade rules to move into industries that have been monopolized by wealthy corporations in the global north. And this monopoly power allows corporations in the global north to charge a markup for their own exports while forcing down the price of imports from the global south. So you can think of, for instance, Apple outsources the production of smartphones, of iPhones and iPads to Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company that employs laborers in China, in sweatshops in China. And now, because of Apple's dominant position in the world market, Apple is able to force down the price of the goods that it purchases from Foxconn. And this means that China essentially finds itself exporting large quantities of embodied labor and resources that it isn't really properly remunerated for. So in addition to this issue of monopoly, another reason that unequal exchange occurs is that the costs of production in the global south externalized. So what I mean by that is that laborers in the global south are paid less than what they ought to be paid, what they would be paid if capitalism actually was a system of free markets and labor could, move around the world and move to high wage areas. Costs of labor in the south are externalized and are compressed and forced to artificially low areas. The ecological costs of production are often not accounted for in the south. So, or the north either, but in the south this problem is much larger. So, for instance, if a company producing, say, palm oil for a large Western multinational goes and levels an entire rainforest, the immense cost of this natural resource isn't taken into account in the final price of the product. So what that means is that really the price of the global south's exports is below their real value. As a result of this, you have this flow of value from the periphery to the core continuously. I actually had the privilege of working with a research team back in 2020 where we analysed global trade and price data around the world. I was working with Jason Hickel from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and also Huzifa Zumkawala, who is a brilliant data analyst in Karachi, Pakistan. And we looked at all this global trade and price data, and we came to the conclusion that every year the South loses about $2.2 trillion over the past few decades through this unequal exchange, through this mechanism of unequal exchange. And in fact, if you look at it since 1960, it's about $62 trillion. So huge sums of money or huge sums of wealth being transferred from the poorer countries to the richer countries.
One mechanism you write a lot about, and one thing we've talked about on the show before with your co-author, Jason, is structural adjustment programs, which we've discussed, but I want to kind of refresh our audience for those, because I think this is another kind of, one of these things that sounds kind of economisty and boring and dry, but is quite politically potent and we would argue somewhat sinister when you really kind of learn what it is and how bad it was, especially a few decades ago. It's still bad now, but I think we would agree it's kind of less bad now, but it's still very much a potent force. You wrote that, quote, between 1981 and 2004, 123 countries comprising 82% of the global population were forced to implement structural adjustment programs. That's a lot of people, 82% of the population of the world. So I want to sort of talk about SAPs and other related debt systems and how they kind of helped fuel global equality, and also explain what you mean by this word force. You wrote that in your quote, and you've actually used it here a couple times already. I think a lot of people listening, people who read The Economist and are savvy, or someone with a globe emoji on Twitter who's an assistant professor of moving numbers around in a paper from the University of whatever, if they're listening, they would say, they're not forced, right? There's this idea of they choose agency without getting too much into the nitty-gritty about how those systems can and have been manipulated by the global north.
These are agreements that countries and economies make with each other, right?
So first off, could you explain the SAPs? Second part, can you kind of tell us what you mean by forced and kind of clear that up for people who may be confused and may believe in this kind of agency discourse?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a good question. So to very briefly describe what SAPs were and what they are, right, to some extent they're still ongoing today. These were agreements that Global South countries entered into with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. As part of these agreements, the Global South countries, so the IMF and World Bank, just for some background, I'm sure that listeners of Citations Needed are aware of this, but the IMF and World Bank, of course, are largely controlled by the rich countries of the global north. So the IMF and World Bank are controlled by their shareholders, right? It's a shareholders' democracy, so to speak. And all their shareholders are the rich governments of the United States and Western Europe. And in fact, the US has a veto power in both institutions. Both institutions are based in Washington, D.C. It's a really significant point, right? The geographical location of these institutions tells you a lot about how they function and how the power dynamics behind them plays out. And these structural adjustment programs that Global South countries implemented during the 1980s and 1990s, they were policy packages. So they were these large neoliberal policy packages where Global South countries, in exchange for accessing the financial resources controlled by the IMF and World Bank, had to implement these neoliberal policies. Really brutal, hardline neoliberal policies, removing minimum wages, removing subsidies for food and fuel and housing and basic essentials, although not cutting, say, funds going towards the military or the police. Often, in fact, funds for the police and military had to increase because you had to sort of quell riots and unrest that started to roll across the global south.
Yeah, when people begin to privatize your water and food, yeah, that'll happen.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to cut back on subsidies for food and water, then you actually have to increase payments to the police and the military. So these hardline neoliberal policies were implemented predominantly during the 1980s and 1990s. In the 21st century, the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, had to pull back a little bit because there were just huge protests across Latin America and Africa and Eastern Europe, which were called structural adjustment riots often in the press. And in fact, the situation got so bad that there was actually a rebellion within the bureaucracy of these organizations. So economists started to resign and very publicly talk about, feeling like they had blood all over their hands for the kind of policies that had been implemented in the name of the IMF and World Bank. So they had to pull back because of the kind of discontent that was being caused. Although that point shouldn't be overstated, there's still a lot of these sort of neoliberal structural adjustment type programs going on. So to your question of why I would say that these programs were forced on the global south. So this kind of discourse around the structural adjustment programs being voluntarily entered into, in my view, that's simply untenable for a couple of reasons. And I think actually we have to take a step back and look at how the global debt system works here. During the colonial period, that is prior to the Second World War, the rich countries of the global north, of course, had directly colonized the lands of the global south, and they were able to use this power to extract huge quantities of resources from their colonies, right? So in India, there's been some really interesting research on India by the economist Utsa Patnaik, who looks at the way that the political economy of British rule in India worked. And she points out that the British government in India was actually using Indian tax revenues to purchase Indian goods and then export them to Britain. So in other words, India was exporting its goods, a large quantity of its goods basically for free. And she estimates that this might have, all up over the 200 years of British rule, cost India about 45 trillion US dollars. So at the end of the colonial period, and that's just India, I mean, you can do the analysis for other countries, Indonesia, I mean, it's a very similar, the Dutch in Indonesia, it's very similar. And even, in fact, in many parts of the world that weren't formally colonized, there were sort of informal colonial relationships that had a similar outcome. So Eastern Europe, for instance, was not formally colonized although Germany made an attempt at it in World War II. But Eastern Europe, for the most part, was not formally colonized, but it was in the control of a conservative landed elite that entered into a sort of economic alliance with manufacturers in England and the Netherlands and Northwest Europe. And these elites enserfed the local population and forced them to produce cheap grain and timber products that could be exported to England and the Netherlands. And in fact, this accounts, during the 16th and 17th and 18th century, this accounts for a lot of the economic growth that Northwest Europe experienced, was this sort of informal colonial relationship with Eastern Europe. But the point that I wanted to make here is that at the end of the colonial period, you have this situation where the former colonial powers are sitting on this huge global surplus. They're at the end of 400 years of extraction and exploitation, and they find themselves in control of this enormous quantity of investable wealth, right, that has been produced by the labour and resources of the peoples of the periphery of the world system. What they can do with this wealth is that they can kind of use it to facilitate new forms of exploitation and extraction, even in the post-colonial period. So all countries need to be able to access the global financial system. Governments everywhere need to be able to access global finance in order to fund, particularly in the global south, in order to fund development and in order to build hospitals and schools. I mean, even the United States, even the rich countries of the global north, right, they borrow from abroad. This is a necessary part of having a functioning economy. I'm not suggesting that global south countries that they don't have domestic resources that they can call upon. They do, and I think that they should try to find ways to become less dependent on northern finance. But at the end of the day, access to global financial systems is necessary for the functioning of governments and for national economies. Now, in the post-colonial period, because these global north countries, these core economies, these powerful states, imperialist states, control this huge financial surplus, they are able to dictate who can and cannot access global finance. Now, during the structural adjustment period, starting in about 1980, the IMF and World Bank say to global south countries, you can't access the global financial system, you can't access new loans, you can't roll over your existing debt, unless you implement these hardline, brutal neoliberal policies. So I would see that as a case of coercion, to use the control over the global surplus to blackmail global south countries into pursuing the kind of policies that benefit the global north by opening up global south economies to exploitation. That there is a clear form of coercion.
And to some extent, they had, before we sort of realized that this was all kind of bogus, I mean, maybe there was even some genuine ideological buy-in, this idea of kind of infinite growth, mutually beneficial growth, this kind of Thomas Friedman narrative of a sort of perpetually upward hockey stick graph. Right. So generously, you could maybe make the argument that at the time there was this genuine belief that we could have, that the rising tide would lift all boats kind of thing, right?
Well, I think that one of the points that we need to confront here is that this wasn't even good bourgeois economics, right?
Oh, it was bad bourgeois economics.
Even on its merits, it was bad.
The United States or Australia, where I live, our governments never would have pursued these kind of policies. This would have never been...
Right.
So you look at how what does the United States do when it faces a economic crisis, right? So in 2008, the US government responds by running huge budget deficits to keep the domestic economy afloat, responds by bailing out the financial sector and spending huge amounts of money, strong intervention in the economy. Now, what the US was telling the Global South to do during the 1980s and 1990s was the opposite of that. You had countries that were facing economic collapse, and the IMF and World Bank were telling them what you need to do is run budget surpluses and spend less money. And so it was bad bourgeois economics.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually want to stay on this point for a second. The idea of the consequences of these policies and of, forcing these policies upon other countries, the kind of hostage situation that you were talking about, Dylan. And I will actually quote you back to you and your excellent co-authors, Jason Hickel and Huzaifa Zoom Kawala. The three of you wrote for Al Jazeera a couple years ago in 2021, this quote, during the 1980s and 1990s, IMF structural adjustment programs cut public sector wages and employment while rolling back labor rights and other protective regulations, all of which cheapened labor and resources. Today, poor countries are structurally dependent on foreign investment and have no choice but to compete with each other to offer cheap labor and resources in order to please the barons of international finance. This ensures a steady flow of disposable gadgets and fast fashion to affluent northern consumers, but at extraordinary cost to human lives and ecosystems in the South, end quote. So I'd love for you to comment on some of those consequences, but also, as we've been discussing on this episode, and actually this is, part 3 of kind of a larger 3-part series on how these systems really interact with human migration and how immigration policies and the kind of national security threat narrative, this kind of influx of refugees or migrants across the globe creates this external invading threat to the wealthy countries of the world. And you get this kind of fortress system, more surveillance, more militarism. I'd love for you, Dylan, to connect the dots for us here between these programs that keep global South countries indebted to this system that does not benefit them, and how that then in turn, it's not just kind of this grandiose economic system that can just be discussed academically, although yes, but also the implications on real people that these programs have, and then how that leads to people having to make the toughest of decisions to then seek safety or seek employment or seek security somewhere else, and then being met with even more coercion, even more aggression, even more violence. Can you kind of connect those things for us?
Yeah, for sure. So, the impact of structural adjustment programs was simply devastating. In fact, it's difficult to overstate the kind of toll in human lives and human well-being that we're talking about here. It caused huge spikes in unemployment, throwing many, many people into unemployment because they could no longer find employment in the state sector, and because the contractionary fiscal policy that the IMF and World Bank forced countries to pursue led to major recessions in many global South economies. So, for instance, if you look at, say, Mexico, for instance. So Mexico, there's a really good website where you can look at a lot of the data on the human welfare during this period in the 1980s and 1990s. The World Inequality database, which is run by Thomas Piketty and some of the other French economists. And they have data on that website on the amount of income per adult in different countries. I was looking at it the other day, and in Mexico, for instance, during structural adjustment programs, income per adult declined from $31,000 in 1981 to $23,000 in 1986, and it still hasn't recovered. As of 2020, it's $25,000. And in fact, a similar trend is true for many countries. So take Ukraine, for instance. In 1989, at the end of the Soviet period, Ukraine had a per adult national income of around $24,500. But today, that's only $15,000, so around half, as a result of the kind of structural adjustment programs that were implemented after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now that's national income, which is sort of a standard macroeconomic. This is the kind of indicator that people in the IMF and World Bank like to use, right? If you look at something like wages, the situation was even worse. So in Mexico, for instance, wages in about 1980, a worker on an average wage in Mexico had enough income to purchase about 4 times their basic needs. So they could meet their subsistence requirements about 4 times over. In the space of about 3 years to 1983, that figure declined to just 1 subsistence basket. They could only just afford their basic needs. And in fact, that level of real wages in Mexico at the height of structural adjustment programs was lower than what wages in Mexico had been in the 18th century, right? We're talking about huge huge dislocation on a historically unprecedented scale and speed. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, the dislocation from structural adjustment programs was so severe that people's physical height actually declined. The physical stature of the generation born in the 1980s in sub-Saharan Africa was lower than what it had been in the previous decades. And in fact, in some countries, so Tanzania, for instance, Mozambique, Madagascar, and South Africa, the height of the population in the 1980s was lower than what it had been in the 19th century, prior to the colonial period. So the effect of structural adjustment programs was so severe that we literally see it show up in the physical stature of the population. Huge levels of dispossession and dislocation and human suffering and harm. One of the things that I think is important to note here is that this dislocation benefited the rich economies of the global north. So by lowering wages, by making labour more precarious, by removing the sort of protections that workers had benefited from in the immediate post-colonial period, these neoliberal reforms acted to basically cheapen southern labour and cheapen southern resources, which then goes on to facilitate this system of unequal exchange that I was describing a moment ago, because everything becomes cheaper, so the global north can gobble up more resources. So in fact, in 1980, so just before the structural adjustment period began, the average price level in the global north was about 1.3 times higher than the average price level in the global south. By 1998, the average price level in the north was 3 times higher than the average price level in the global south.
So let's talk about you and your co-authors' critics. Some people listening to this may roll their eyes and say, okay, is this citations needed? Blaming America, blaming the white man. Maybe they would even traffic in some squishy liberal discourse around removing agency or some piffle. I want to sort of talk about that, specifically Max Roser, who's argued, and he's kind of a Bill Gates booster. He's kind of Bill Gates one-man sort of PR guy, which is because a lot of this is, there is a kind of a prevailing Gates narrative that everything's going well. It's a sort of Nicholas Kristof, this year was the best year ever. An article he's written every year for the last 6 years, although he, as we mentioned at the top of the show, he skipped it during COVID. But he just did it about 6 months ago again. Saying,
yeah, it's back. We're back, folks.
Yeah, everything's even back. We're gonna ignore that. And they would say, for example, Rosa wrote a post in 2018 saying, quote, global income inequality increased for 2 centuries, but is now falling. Their argument now is that global inequality is actually going down. What do you say to that? Now, obviously, things are not quite as you yourself and we say are not as starkly cartoonishly evil as they were, like, say, in the 90s. Obviously, you have other competitors. You have China. You have, quote unquote, rising India, Brazil, etc. So some of these north-south distinctions are maybe even a little fuzzier in terms of power dynamics, which, of course, upsets a lot of people in Brussels and Washington. But what do you say to people like Rosa who say it's actually that the neoliberal World Bank Gates narrative has delivered on creating a more equal world?
Yeah, so this is a common narrative. I mean, it's been made by Max Roser and Our World in Data, but they're hardly the only ones. Branko Milanovic, who's a former World Bank economist, has been making a very similar argument. I think he says that we're living in the age of convergence, that is, the convergence of income between the global south and the global north. The thing to grasp here is that when it comes to inequality, it kind of all depends on how you massage the numbers. The way that we measure inequality, there's multiple different ways of measuring inequality, and these often lead to different conclusions. For instance, I mean, the metrics that Max Roser uses, for instance, Max Roser uses the Gini coefficient. So Our World in Data use the Gini coefficient and a few other indicators, what we would call relative measures of inequality, as opposed to absolute measures of inequality. So to sort of explain what I mean by that, it sort of might be worth actually looking at what some of the income data actually says, and I can talk us through the difference between this absolute and relative measures of inequality, and we can sort of chat about the political implications of which one we want to use. So in 1990, the emerging and developing economies, as defined by the IMF, and this includes most of Latin America, all of Latin America, in fact, most of Asia, with the exception of Japan and South Korea, Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe as well. So these emerging and developing economies, what we might call or what I've been calling the periphery or the global south, they had an income, a GDP per capita of $4,700. Now, I'm measuring this in purchasing power parity terms. So for your listeners, purchasing power parity essentially just means that this is adjusted for price differences across countries and across time. It's all adjusted to the price level in the United States in 2017. So the periphery had about $4,700. The United States at that time had an average GDP of $40,400. Now, a relative measure of inequality would be to take the ratio of US per capita GDP to the periphery's per capita GDP.
So like a 10-to-1.
Yes, exactly. And if we take this ratio, we get a figure that it was about 8.5. So that is to say US income was about 8.5 times higher than the incomes in the periphery. But an absolute measure would be to look at simply the gap in income between the periphery and the US. So if we subtract the periphery's income from the US income, we get a figure of about $35,700. So that's the difference between a relative and an absolute measure of inequality. Let's fast forward to 2022. So in 2022, the periphery's income had increased to $12,000 per capita. US income, on the other hand, had increased to $64,700 per capita. Now, because the periphery's income has grown by more than the US's in percentage terms, that means that our measure of relative inequality has declined. So the ratio of US to peripheral income is now 5.4 in 2022, down from 8.5. So that would suggest that there's been a decline in inequality, and this is the kind of metric that's being used by most mainstream economists.
Yeah, you mentioned this is one narrative. To be clear, this is the narrative. This is the narrative.
This is the dominant narrative.
People have beaten over their head, right, by 1,000 different news outlets a day. So continue.
Yeah, it's huge in the Western press and even in much of academia, in fact. But now if we look at an absolute measure of inequality, so if we just look at the gap in income between the US and the periphery, we find that that has grown to $52,600. So the absolute gap has grown from about $35,700 to $52,600. So that's an increase of around $17,000. I'm kind of rounding up here, so the figures I'm giving might not quite work in the same way as they do if you have the precise numbers. But so that's a huge increase. So we're talking about an increase of about $17,000 in the gap between the United States and the periphery. So the question is, what gives a more accurate picture of inequality? Is it this absolute gap or is it this relative metric? Now, both metrics are fine on their own terms, right? They're both measuring something real. Neither's incorrect, yeah? They're both real measurements. But I would argue that in a situation where the United States already has so much more wealth than the rest of the world, so much higher income than the rest of the world, is already has so much more than what the country needs. I'm not saying that everybody in the United States has more than they need. There's huge problems with inequality. But the aggregate income is more than sufficient, many times higher than what is needed to meet people's needs. In a situation like that, it doesn't make sense to me to say that inequality has declined when there has been a $17,000 increase in the scale of the gap between the US and the global South. And I should say, I think it represents, whether we choose to use absolute or relative measures, in a sense, it depends on one's class perspective. If you are Bill Gates, or if you're a rich middle-class consumer in the United States or Australia, it might make sense to use a relative metric, because you might think, oh, my income should continue to grow at the same speed at people in the global South. But if you're somebody in the global South, if you're a poor peasant farmer who's exploited by large multinational corporations, from the perspective of somebody in that class position, what's going to matter more, I would argue, is the absolute gap, because it's this, you're in a situation where the people exploiting you already have so much more income than they could ever need. it doesn't make sense to say that they deserve, that they should get similar percentage increases in their income to what you as a poor Colombian peasant are getting.
Right. And as you alluded to, of course, even using the average American as a proxy rather than, let's say, the top 1% of US or Europe also kind of, I think, skews it a certain way, right? Because the issue with what we mean by the quote unquote global north, I mean, really isn't some guy living in South Chicago. I mean, that's not really who we're, I mean, I know there are certain advantages in being an American and being in the global north inherently, but, you know, again, even within that system itself, there's so much inequality that it seems to be skewing the average quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And in fact, if we were to look at the average income of the top 1% in the United States, then inequality has increased even in relative terms. So the ratio of global South income to the income of the top 1% has been declining in recent decades, right? So if we're looking at the top 1%, then inequality's been rising, whether it's relative or absolute.
And it matters a great deal, as you also note, with how you measure things like extreme poverty. I know that, again, previously your co-author Jason Hickel when he's on the show, talked a lot about the way you cook the books is by putting, at $1.25 versus $5.
Exactly. Like the kind of basic needs poverty line versus whatever other metrics that like the World Bank uses.
Yeah.
So everything you've been talking about here reinforces this idea that there are systems at work that keep entire communities, entire countries, indeed entire economies in a state of perpetual precarity, if not worse. I mean, you add to that sanctions, you add, imperial war, you add sometimes civil war, you add famine, you add environmental displacement and destruction, all kind of mixed together with these, deliberately manufactured and maintained systems of austerity, right? So it makes sense, as we've been talking about, it makes sense that people would move to places that seem more secure or potentially may offer a different kind of life, or at least the potential for that. And this leads to, again, the issue of migration as like a logical consequence of this gross and sustained inequality. Now, what I think is so fascinating about your work and the work that you do with your, co-researchers and co-authors is that you don't only outline these issues about metrics and about whether it's inequality or poverty, but you also offer ideas that there can be an alternative, right? There can be other systems that are more humane. So, Dylan, as a final question here, can you tell us about how this can be different? What different policies, what different systems, what different concepts of even how we understand success for a society, right? Maybe it's not grow all the time. How this can lead to a different kind of future for people on this planet. I know it's, maybe kind of hokey to say, but what are ways that we can rethink these systems so that they don't just wind up, of course, funneling even more military equipment to governments across the world, phony loans to the global south that can never actually be paid back by design. What are different systems that we can look toward?
Yeah, so if I can start with the question about migration, I think you make an excellent point that when you have a system of wide global inequality, you're always going to get this situation where people in the periphery find themselves trying to move to the core regions. And in fact, I think what we need to confront is that structural adjustment programs and neoliberal policies and these networks of global exploitation and extraction actually created a refugee crisis, right? You had hundreds of millions of people dispossessed of their access to land, employment, affordable food, housing, and other essential goods, and they had to flee. And I think that we need to have the clarity to speak about this as and confront it as a refugee crisis. We have this bizarre distinction in the global north and in the west between what's called refugees and economic migrants. And what that distinction seems to mean in the mainstream press is refugees are people who are legitimately fleeing, according to this narrative, refugees are people who are legitimately fleeing political persecution and violence, while economic migrants are just, searching for better economic opportunities and they're not really deserving of help and protection. But, I think we need to be clear that the violence of poverty and structural adjustment is just as real and devastating as the violence of bombs dropped from airplanes and missiles shot by fighter jets. If somebody is fleeing Putin's war against Ukraine, right, which has killed perhaps tens of thousands of people, if somebody is fleeing that devastation, they're considered a refugee in the West, quite rightly. But if somebody is fleeing the everyday violence of poverty and malnutrition, which kills literally millions of people every year, then they're not considered a refugee. And this is predicated in a bizarre classical liberal view that political rights are more important than economic and social rights. Because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly states that everybody should, has a right to access food and employment and the goods they need for survival, housing. And yet, if somebody flees the immense devastation and violence and destruction and death caused by their systematic denial to these resources, then we suddenly turn around and act like they're not really in need of protection.
Well, that was just like a personal choice that they made and whatever.
So onto this question of alternatives. So there's many things we can do. So the first thing to state is that we need an end to the political and military basis of imperialism. So we need to withdraw US and to some extent Australian and Western European militaries from the global south, withdraw all the military bases, stop engaging in imperial wars, including on Iraq, for instance, because it's these systems of direct military control that provide the global north with the capacity to force its will onto other states. In fact, there's probably one of the most easy things that we can do to confront global inequality is simply to stop invading other countries. Beyond that, democratizing the institutions of global finance is an essential step. So I mentioned before that at the end of the colonial period, the countries of the global north, of the core of the world system, found themselves in control of the global financial infrastructure, the surplus of investable resources that we all need to be able to survive. Democratizing the way that that surplus is allocated and used is essential. So that would allow global south countries to access financial resources without having to cave to the pressure of Washington and the international financial institutions. Beyond that, though, I think we need to start thinking of how we can move towards a post-capitalist economic system, a system of global socialism, global socialist planning that can meet the needs of everybody in the world. A few steps that can be taken in that direction, for instance, could be to establish a global universal basic income, which is sufficient for accessing food and housing.
Well, now you're talking crazy. We're running out of time. Thanks a lot. No, go ahead.
Systems of universal access to resources work really well. Really, I mean, we often have this narrative especially in the West, that, socialism has failed, capitalism has proved itself to be the only sort of system capable of delivering people's needs. But in fact, the socialist experiences of the 20th century, for all of their flaws, and there were huge flaws in terms of political repression and planning failures, but for all of those flaws, there were huge successes as well. Cuba, for instance, which has a system of universal access to food. So everybody in Cuba is entitled to a modest quantity of food through the state rationing system, virtually for free. It's sold at about 1/10 of its market price, sold by the state at about 1/10 of its market price. And Cuba, despite being a sort of lower middle income country, has a lower death rate from protein energy malnutrition, that is deaths just from lack of weight for height. Cuba has a lower death rate from malnutrition than the United States and Western Europe. Much higher income countries with much higher levels of resource use. So learning from these kind of systems, I think, is an important step forward, and looking at ways that we can scale these systems up to the global level is something that we need to think seriously about. The Cuban food provisioning system has worked so remarkably well in the context of a brutal blockade that we really need to think about ways that this system could be emulated and brought to the global level to ensure that everybody has access to food.
Well, buddy, listen, if there's a floor, then how do you have a race to the bottom? The whole point of the race to the bottom is that there's no bottom. So if you have a bottom, the whole fucking system breaks down, man. Come on, there needs to be, just as there is domestically, a fixed number of really, really poor, starving people. Otherwise, how do we get the guys to sow the soccer balls in Bangladesh? You don't. So that doesn't work. You know, the second you create a global UBI, we're all fucked. You know, we had a UBI in the United States for about 14 months, and the entire capital class took one big shit in their diapers.
Yeah, how will I get cheap child slaves to produce my coffee and my chocolate? You know, it's just won't work if they have access to food.
Doesn't work. Yeah, they wouldn't take the job.
I think that's a great place to leave it. The idea of linking not only the research and the data to these alternative futures is, I think, so important. So just, thank you so much for joining us today. We've been speaking with Dylan Sullivan, adjunct fellow and PhD student in the School of Social Sciences at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, where he teaches in politics, sociology, and anthropology. As you heard, his research focuses on global inequality, colonial history, and the economics of socialist planning, as you laid out so incredibly wonderfully for us. Thank you again, Dylan, for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Thanks. It's been excellent.
Yeah, I think just in general, the idea that there are hundreds of thousands of people who would take such an incredible risk to their lives and self in order to make a movement from point A to point B, and that the underlying conditions, because again, it's not a huge leap for the liberal mind to say, well, what's causing that, right? Mm-hmm. Kamala Harris talks about root causes all. It's sort of trendy to talk about root causes. But then when you hear what the root causes are always these kind of patronizing David Brooks kind of quasi-racism about cultural failings, right? Corruption. You always hear about corruption. They need to straighten out their own economies. They need healthier institutions. The idea that these international trade deals, right? It's like the concept of, part of the liberal rules-based order is this idea of rule of law. There's a Transparency Foundation Rule of Law award they give, which is going to be its own episode at some point. It was started and created by the former IP lawyer for Microsoft, and it's primarily focused on patent and copyright enforcement. So when people talk about rule of law, a lot of times what they mean is making sure that these international corporations, these global north created corporations, can enforce copyright laws in the global south. This is really what they're talking about when they talk about things like rule of law and anti-corruption. It's not entirely, but it's a lot of it, right? And what this does, again, like as we've mentioned on the show, it's a geopolitical equivalent of black on black crime, right? It's like we're not going to worry about the actual root causes that caused these inequities, the racism, the historical sort of, colonial and neo-colonial systems of extraction, of colonial exploitation. We're just going to sort of put the burden on the poor countries for being poor because they need to, get their house in order, which is really great because it gets everybody off the hook. It doesn't really upset anyone. And it doesn't put any of the blame on these trade deals that are overwhelmingly and almost uniformly supported by corporations and neoliberal politicians of both parties.
Exactly. The shitholedness of the countries is inherent and pathological. It comes from nowhere. It is just the natural order of things.
And the conservative is just mindlessly racist, but the liberal is a little more sophisticated with that kind of quasi-racism. Because then if you say it's root causes or it's corruption, it sounds kind of race neutral, but really what you're ultimately doing is you're just blaming countries for being poor themselves. Now, that isn't to say there isn't corruption, right? There is, and there is, things that certain countries could do on their own. But, on an existential or basic level, these inequities that are reinforced by these trade policies, again, you say trade policies, people's eyes glaze over, but it's like, no, it's like really, really important because it creates human suffering. The stakes couldn't be higher. And the fact that it sounds boring is what makes it so powerful. The fact that it seems obscure and esoteric.
Right. That's what's so sinister.
And they made a joke about that, like on the Jimmy Fallon thing. It's like, oh, it's just this boring trade deal. And it's just guys in suits and they're hanging out in some office somewhere. And it's like, yeah, but those are humans that are being on the other end of that contract, the other end of that quote unquote trade deal that are going to suffer. And they have suffered. We have the data from NAFTA. It's been almost 30 years. Like we know it increased poverty. It certainly didn't decrease poverty. We know it caused a lot of social disruption, a lot of human movement, a disruption of more traditional economies and farming. This isn't some mystery. And actually, in fact, when they were promoting TPP, many of its promoters say, oh, this is not going to be like NAFTA. So they're sort of acknowledged that the last one didn't work. This is going to have this and that. We're going to teach people how to code and whatever kind of bullshit. And so when you look at immigration coverage, these global inequities that are fueled by these so-called trade deals is never, ever, 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 ever mentioned. Again, forget the lack of mentioning of coups and disrupting, governments and supporting despotic or autocratic regimes in Latin America and Asia from the 60s, 70s to today. Forget the sanctions on countries like Venezuela and Cuba that have really hurt their economies. Forget all that. Like, that's not even mentioned.
You can just look at the paperwork.
Yeah. It's just never mentioned. It's just this thing from nowhere that just happened. They're just poor because they've always been poor. And it's like, but they really haven't.
No, and similarly, it's like talking about people being in deep debt, say student debt or, mortgages that are unable to be paid, but without looking at the promises made by the predatory lending practices that led directly to this debt and this, idea of owing back, right? Well, you signed the thing, so you just owe it back. But there are all of these predatory lending practices, and that goes from whether it is student debt here in the United States or these quote unquote development systems established by the IMF, the World Bank, USAID. All of these systems are about predatory lending. It's just what the global North has decided to extract from these countries, the conditions under which they keep them beholden to those systems, to those governments, to those institutions. It's no surprise, as we were talking about with Dylan, that both the IMF and the World Bank are based in Washington, D.C., right? Like, this all works together. And so, we really wanted to outline how immigration and the global banking systems are deeply intertwined and how the media consistently fails to connect these things.
Nobody wants to have us to blame, even in part, right? Because we're this magnanimous beacon on a city on a hill. So when it seems more like we're a feudal lord inviting people into our manor for crumbs, it's not as romantic.
Right. And then locking the doors, mind you. Not so much inviting, but rather having that candle in the upper turret and keeping the drawbridge up. So, wow, that's really going deep with that metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay, that will do it for this 3-part series on immigration narratives in the media. Thank you all for listening. Of course, you can follow Citations Needed on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and if you are so inclined, and we hope that you are, consider becoming a supporter of our show through patreon.com/citationsneededpodcast. All your support through Patreon is incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded. And as always, a very special shout out goes to our critic level supporters on Patreon. And they include Brad Hayward, Zach Cathcart, Lorenzo Mitchell, Ben Lazar, Morgan Green Hopkins, Ed Zitron, Corporate Zombie, Eric Joyner, Buzz Among Us, Stinky Pete, DL Singfield, J.M. Geralt, Chris Vincent, Nigel Kirby, Scott Roth, Porter Schutt, Zachary Henson, Josh Durlam, Joe Wengert, Steely Dan Halen, Douglas Danger Manley, Green New Neil, Trasdat, Brickshop Audio, Supple Old Man, David McMurray, MSP, William Rush, Garrett Geisler, Jason Eason, Chris Sarah, Dash X, James Michaela, Greg Westney, Drew Johnson, Max Belanger, David Bettner, Brendan O'Connor, Ultra Miraculous, Zappo, Sturm Wyvern, Darren Brady, Bart DeCourcy, Ra, Max Wilsey, Blake Bunell, Xenia Zedvornik, Brendan Hines, Doc Reitzel, Philip Moss, Rulos Bar, Jameson Saltzman, Shockfist, Weed Lord, AI Scare, Backups, Care, and of course, Computer Scare. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Our senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trenda Lightburn. Newsletter by Marco Cardellano. Transcriptions are by Mahnor Imran. The music is by Grandaddy. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.